Hi, and welcome to RAVE Leader Chat Week 12 for the book of Acts, coinciding with Acts chapter 12. One of the things that Acts has done is it's given us an honest depiction of life in the early church. And one of the things we see this week is that same honesty. We recall as we started back in the beginning that the church got out of the blocks pretty well and the day of Pentecost came, but it wasn't too long after that Peter was arrested and brought up, Peter and John were arrested, brought up on charges. And so you find this sort of ebb and flow throughout the book of Acts, which is a depiction of what the church really faces. God is trying to do something powerful and amazing, and yet the evil one and the world have different plans, and so there's this struggle, and we get that struggle once again here. Chapter 11 ended with the church, a glimpse of the church in Antioch and believers, the gospel not only spreading, but believers being confirmed. And so we turn to chapter 12, and we instantly get this power struggle that goes on. And it says that about that time, Herod, the king, laid violent hands on some who belonged to the church. Well, who is this Herod? This is Herod Agrippa the First. He's the grandson of Herod the Great. And he is not royalty per se, other than appointed by the Roman government, but he has this precarious position where he needs to placate the Roman government, but also the territory that he is in charge of, he needs to keep everybody in line, and since it's predominantly Jewish, he wants to make sure things go well with them as also. And so he begins to lay hands violently on them, and then it just says, as a matter of fact, he killed James, the brother of John, with the sword. So this is the first disciple who has been martyred for the faith. You had Stephen a couple chapters back as a deacon who was, but this is the first one of the original 12 that was killed. And then notice we catch that sort of tension there when we hear that this pleased the crowd, and so Herod wants to continue. At this point, I think question one is a good question for you. What's Herod's plan? But a second follow-up question to that is maybe what's his underlying assumption of what would happen next, or maybe how this was going to play out. And I think that'd be an interesting question to wrestle with. So we have... he decides that this is going to work and it's going to please the Jewish constituents. So what does he do? He decides to arrest Peter. And there's a little bit of time that goes on, but notice God is in the timing as well. Herod has his schemes, but God has his plan and his timing, and it always supersedes. God is sovereign through all things. And so we read this was during the days of unleavened bread. Well, the Feast of Unleavened Bread in Jewish tradition meant that you couldn't do a trial and you couldn't sentence anybody. So Peter really is arrested, and he just is held there. And so we read how firmly he's held, that there's 4 sets of 4 guards over him. And then we also notice what the church is up to. In response to all these things, what does the church do? So often we'd refer to it as just prayer, but the church gathers together and prays. And then what takes place next is miraculous. Beginning at verse 6, we have Peter being rescued. It's tremendous. And one of the things that one of the commentators pointed out is that Peter is not anxious about these circumstances. Peter trusts God so implicitly. He's able to sleep in prison. He's not worried. He's not sweating. Paul's going to talk about that contentment in every situation later. But somehow Peter and Paul are blessed with such great faith and confidence in the Lord that whether they live or whether they die, they are the Lord's. Peter's able to sleep right through it so heavily that the angel that comes has to sort of thump him, has to wake him sort of vigorously. And then all the details are there for you to look at. He doesn't know whether he's in a dream state or what's going on until he's fully out. And we get that at 11, Peter finally realizes the truth that he's been freed. And notice once again, it is the Lord who has sent the angel. All credit goes to Jesus. And that's another thing to notice here. It is not Peter's initiative. It is godly initiative. Peter really does nothing but wakes up and does what he's told to do. And so he escapes. So this passage speaks about this great battle comparison between King Herod and King Jesus. And that is picked up in question 7 that I want to sort of bring to your attention as well. A good one to sort of think about the comparisons and what that really means. So often we see some sort of human threat arise against God's church, and we think, oh no, this is going to be, and yet as we read the scriptures, we see God is sovereign, God is faithful, and God is more than ample. And so we want to make sure we sort of highlight and notice that. Verses 17 and I'm sorry, verses 18. Well, actually, first then in verse 12, once Peter's freed, where does he go? He goes back to the church that's been praying for him, and there's some confusion there. Rhoda, who's at the door, says this sounds exactly like Peter. She goes and tells the crowd, and it's one of the questions in the book is a great question about why do they struggle to believe, and why do we struggle to believe that God answers our prayers? If we truly pray and we really expect God to answer our prayers, if we believe that the prayer is powerful and effective, and that God answers prayer, why are they surprised and why are we surprised? And so that kind of comes to the end. He meets with them. He meets with them and says, hey, tell James. That's James, the brother of Jesus, not James, the brother of John, who was just slain. There can be some confusion if we read that too quickly. And then that really gets to the end of that. And then what you have in verses 18 and 19 is the summation of what's the fallout in Herod's world. And initially, the fallout is the official consequences. And it says that the soldiers woke up and he wasn't there. And they searched, and it says, as was the rule of law at the time, that if someone escaped while you were on duty, your just punishment was their sentence. And since Peter was going to be put to death, they are killed. And it says that in verse 18. Or that should be put to death. And then he says he goes down. Now the spotlight shifts to Herod. Herod has flexed his muscles in this passage, and now the rest of this is really about Herod's demise. And so in verse 20, we hear that there was a political squabble going on, that some of the people from Tyre and Sidon had come down and were trying to work out some difficulties with him. And they needed food from Herod. And Herod then takes credit for being sort of God in this situation, being the ultimate power. And then immediately an angel of the Lord strikes him down, and he dies a pretty violent death, eaten by worms and breathing his last breath. This may sound a little bit fantastic, but the Jewish historian Josephus does talk about an abrupt end to Herod with some sort of stomach ailment that could include worms. So this seems to be substantiated very clearly. We always believe that God's word is true, and that God brings the truth to us, and it goes out and never returns void. So don't let people be surprised by that. This is substantiated. And once again, that comparison question is a great one. What about Herod, who flexed his muscles, who had earthly power? It's a great reminder that all human authorities are secondary authorities. And to cap that off, you turn to verse 24, the summation. While Herod is now deceased, it just says quite plainly, the word of the Lord increased and multiplied. It went out and did its business. And so you cannot stop God's word. You might be able to stop a human Christian leader for a time, but you cannot stop the God who has called and equipped that person. You can't stop the word of the Lord. This passage then ends with just a quick update on Barnabas and Saul. They had returned from Jerusalem and completed their service, and they once again are with John Mark, and then that sets the stage for what's about to take place next. So want to continue to just rejoice in your RAVE group and your leadership. Know that I continue to pray for you. Continue to just love your people and to invite them into God's word. Thanks, and God bless.